Hi, I'm Brett Godfrey, and for this installment of Viewpoint, I'd like to read to you just a little bit. I'm going to read to you from chapter 29 of my first thriller, Black Sunrise, soon to be followed by its sequel, Convergence of Demons. I hope you enjoy this. Chapter 29. The Palace Arms was one of Denver's oldest and finest restaurants, located in the ancient and lavish Brown Palace Hotel, built in 1892 in the heart of downtown Denver. Moguls of industry and finance, professional sports stars, and even several American presidents frequented the wedge-shaped building. The accoutrements included beautiful Napoleonic artifacts. The cuisine was impeccable and priced accordingly. The smell of lilacs and well-oiled leather drifted in the air with faint harp music and light banter. Seated at a quiet table were Mark and Janet Jensen, Robert Sand, Dave Thomas, and Albert Brecht. Brecht and the Jensens were staying in the hotel, occupying two top-floor suites sealed behind walls of opaque glass, unlike the rooms on all the lower floors, which opened to a cavernous atrium looking down on the lavishly appointed lobby. Dwight Eisenhower and his retinue had occupied these top-floor suites during the summer of 1955, when he'd endured a long period of illness. Many guests reported that it felt like sleeping in the White House. The decor was the same, as was the service. While their circumstances were not conducive to the enjoyment of luxury, the pleasant surroundings provided them a welcome respite and the illusion of normalcy. After a long and stressful day, Mark and Janet had reluctantly agreed to Brecht's suggestion that they dine in elegance and relax briefly so they could decompress while conversing in quiet privacy at a relatively isolated table in the far corner of the restaurant. Brecht assured them that the rest of the team was still at work. He wore his habitual black three-piece suit. "I'm sure you must have noticed the scar by now," he said, touching the spot behind his right ear. Jensen noticed a tremor in his hand. "From a bullet," Brecht continued. "Your father dug it out of my skull in the basement of a building in Moscow. It was 1956, the year after Eisenhower stayed at this hotel. I visited him often in those days, so I have bittersweet memories of this place. Then the next year, I nearly died. Your father saved my life, at great personal peril. Did he ever tell you the story?" "No," Jensen conceded. "My father was very strict about keeping other people's medical details to himself, and I have the feeling this particular event was something they warned him not to discuss." Brecht regarded Mark for a moment, his chin lifting slightly. There was far more to this secret than any medical privacy. The incident was highly classified, a matter of national security. The record remains sealed to this day. Sand said, "Cold War espionage." Brecht canted his head, twitching his cottony eyebrows. A waiter hovered just out of earshot, politely awaiting a signal to approach. Brecht summoned him with a toss of his hand. At length, the waiter finished describing various entrees and took their orders, while his second refilled water glasses with Pellegrino from a large green bottle he had stored in an ice-filled decanter on a small stand beside the table. Once the waiter and his helper were gone, Brecht muttered something about writers and spooks. Jensen took a small sip of single malt from a heavy crystal tumbler. "Can you tell us about it, Albert?" Brecht nodded. "You should know what happened. It's part of your family history. Mark, ancient history though it is." Reaching into his jacket, Brecht withdrew a large cigar and, after rolling it between his fingers for a few silent seconds, placed it on the tablecloth before him. Jensen knew he longed to light it, but would not. He told himself that after they recovered Christy and Jackie safely and alive, they would smoke a pair of Cubans together. Different days then, Brecht said. No spy satellites, no cell phones, no supercomputers to crack codes, none of the gadgets we have today. We gathered our intelligence the old-fashioned way. We recruited spies, co-opting men and women with access to sensitive information. We collected the secrets we stole from our analysts from deep, dead drops that made their way to Washington in diplomatic pouches. The analysts first decrypted some of it aboard naval vessels or in basements in London. British and American intelligence agencies worked a bit more intimately in those days. The bond forged in the war was still fresh. The practicalities of geography meant a lot more back then. The Brits were stronger than they are now. We needed them. Janet cut in with a question. The British are still our allies, though, aren't they? Brecht chuckled. Yes, certainly, Janet. But the world situation is far more complicated now. Russia is an ally one day and an enemy the next. Putin supports some of our military efforts and yet threatens us with nuclear cruise missiles that can hit any spot on the globe. We play our enemies and our allies as pawns. How so? With the fall of the Iron Curtain, Russia is becoming a democracy. The Cold War is over. We are the only true superpower, aren't we? It should be simpler, not more complicated. Brecht picked up his cigar and rolled it absently between his crooked fingers. The U.S. is no longer the dominant power in the world, Janet. China and India have far larger armies, and China's navy is much larger than any other, with technology every bit the equal to our own, if not superior. Many nations have nuclear weapons, including South Africa, Israel, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and soon Iran will as well, despite the best efforts of the Mossad, MI6, and the CIA. Our golden gates are closed now. The Statue of Liberty is merely a historic artifact. We live in a very unstable world. Terrorists abound and often do not know what they are fighting for or who controls them. Bin Laden is dead. Al-Qaeda has gone out of style. ISIS is on the way out, only to be replaced by dozens of other terrorist groups. In the late 50s, we considered a nation a superpower if it presented a nuclear threat. Given the size and geography of our country, situated between ally nations that span an entire hemisphere, and with the strength of our military, we believed that only through strategic nuclear bombardment could anyone overcome us. We deemed a nation with that ability a superpower, not on the strength of its economy, but because it was a threat to us, and we considered ourselves a superpower, a word we coined for ourselves out of pure hubris. Only a nation that could vaporize cities qualified for that title. Today, if we apply the definitions and thinking of that era, practically every nation is a superpower. A bearded Muslim huddling in a cave can bring down skyscrapers in the heart of New York City. Our electronic infrastructure is the life support of all commerce and communication and controls every aspect of our lives. We use the internet to turn on our lights and lock our doors, yet the World Wide Web is vulnerable to crippling attacks launched from internet cafes in Buenos Aires, the Sahara, or anywhere else. Computer viruses self-replicate. A teenager with a laptop could theoretically crash our stock markets. We are vulnerable in ways we never dreamed of during the Cold War, which ironically is what spawned the same internet that now leaves us so vulnerable to cyber attack. The political fragmentation of various groups hostile to our interests makes monitoring them all and predicting their actions a nightmare. In fact, listen to me. I'm sorry to prattle on so. Not at all, Albert, Janet said encouragingly. Your wisdom and world knowledge is truly fascinating, and frankly, I'm thankful for the distraction. And to think that up until tonight I blamed all of our global upsets and human cruelties on United Airlines. Everyone chuckled at politely at Sand's dry jest. Yes, Brecht replied. United Airlines and every other corporation that uses or manufactures advanced technology. Who made the jets that took down the World Trade Center? Who made the world a global village? Remember the USS Cole? Before that happened, who would have thought untrained men in a rubber raft could cripple a U.S. Navy destroyer? Throughout the Cold War, the media and our government portrayed the USSR as a terrible menace, a threat to the future of mankind. But our friends in the Kremlin never actually attacked us on the scale of a modern terrorist. Are you saying they're our friends? In some ways they are. And in other ways they're our foes, Brecht answered. But they've never killed our civilians on our own soil, at least in large numbers. People often say we hung at the brink of nuclear war with them for more than half a century, but we enjoyed what military analysts call strategic peace that entire time. That means there were no overt military hostilities of magnitude. By the end of World War II, we saw Pearl Harbor as something that would never happen again. Yet, here we sit in the aftermath of 9/11 and wonder what will happen next. No, Janet, we are not the only superpower. There are no superpowers anymore, at least not in the definitions we used when the word was coined. Or perhaps another way to put it would be to say that everybody is a superpower these days. Now, every Tom, Dick, and Harry can get his hands on a piece of military hardware. Brecht winked at Jensen. Not that an L-39 in the hands of a trial lawyer is necessarily a threat to mankind, he said in reference to Jensen's restored Soviet fighter. Jensen knew better than to be surprised. The old man knows everything. You sound like you miss the good old days, he offered. Not at all, Mark. There's no time like the present. I merely submit that those were very different times. I was just a boy then. We were all children, even me. But you were an adult, Janet countered, doing a rough job behind the Iron Curtain. In those days, we thought we were fighting for the survival of mankind, or at least the American way of life. And what did you do in those days? I was a spy, Janet, and I recruited other spies from the Soviet military politic. As he said this, Brecht pointed to the bright red star on the side of the green bottle of mineral water that lay planted in the ice bucket next to the table, as if the bottle were a product of the Communist Party rather than a town in Italy. Janet had another question. Did you ever have to kill anyone? Brecht chuckled at the abruptness of the question. Then his mirth subsided, and he stared at his unlit cigar for a moment before answering. When he spoke, he gazed directly into her eyes. Janet, you may think me a monster, but I rarely had to kill, at least not in self-defense or to save my own life. But kill I did. Why? Janet's eyes were wide. Honey, I don't think, Brecht interrupted Jensen's protestations. Mark, hers is a fair question. It was a long time ago. I don't mind talking about it. Not to the family of Conrad Jensen. Albert, please forget I asked. It's just I overstepped my bounds. It was terribly rude of me. The question just slipped out. Janet was clearly flustered. Not to worry, Brecht placated her. It's a perfectly natural question. Most of it is still classified, but I can tell you that I was absolutely sure that every time I took a life, it saved more lives. American lives? American, British, and Russian, possibly more. Janet nodded, lowering her eyes. There are many evil men in the world. You see, Brecht plowed on, we were fighting to understand a mysterious and dangerous enemy. It was much more than merely a war of ideologies, a clash of political beliefs. We were on the brink of nuclear war for generations, or so we thought at the time, and the information our espionage operations generated included not only data relating to the military capabilities and readiness of the Soviet Union, we were desperate to learn how deeply the communists had infiltrated our own political system, our government, and our military. We feared a cancerous ideology that could end our way of life, our great traditions, from within. Janet nodded. I read a book once that suggested our own CIA assassinated JFK because the Russians had blackmailed him to become a spy. The idea was that someone had filmed him when he was young doing something so embarrassing that he had no choice but to cooperate with the Russians to avoid a scandal that could bring down the entire U.S. government. They manipulated our political system to get him into the White House, and in a way, the whole country was susceptible to blackmail. He became the ultimate mole. So we had no choice but to engineer his assassination. Brecht picked up the ball and carried it forward. It was exactly that kind of paranoia that led to the draconian measures of the McCarthy era as we struggled to root out communism from the fabric of American society. Was there any truth to that theory about JFK? I thought you wanted to hear about me killing people or Mark's heroic father saving me. Janet Jensen had been married to a trial lawyer for more than 2 decades. So my question's off limits? Your question about JFK? Yes. Janet smiled. Let's table that for another time. I have a tale to tell that's much closer to home for you and your husband. Let's hear it, Sand prompted, smiling and gesturing with his finger as if to reel in a fish on a rod. At that moment, the waiter reappeared, this time with 2 assistants to begin serving their first course. They arranged plates and refilled glasses. Then the waiter and his minions departed. For a few minutes, no one spoke as they stared into their dinners. No one wanted to prompt Brecht or open a new subject, so they waited patiently. After he had taken a few bites of his steak, Brecht took a gulp of mineral water and cleared his throat. I told Dave about this a few days ago, but you'll find this interesting, and I'll add some details he doesn't know yet, Brecht said. Thomas nodded encouragingly, clearly interested to hear more about Brecht's history with Conrad Jensen. I learned much of what I know long after it happened. I had to piece this together with scraps from various sources because my own memory was less than complete. During the late 50s, I was working under non-official cover in Moscow. I was a spy with no diplomatic status. My role, as I've said, was to recruit Soviet agents. Our best prospects were often the ministerial employees at government offices and factories, people who had no power, but who lived in the shadows of those who did and who had access to sensitive information. On occasion, however, we sought to recruit the bigger fish, the people who were within the Russian bear's inner cave. I'll omit the trivial details of my assignment. Suffice to say that I was betrayed, shot in the head and stomach, and left to die on a street in Moscow. Through some quirk of ballistics, I survived. 1 bullet lodged in the occipital lobe of my brain. He pointed to the spot behind his right ear. The slug passed through the bone but stopped just inside my skull, doing minor damage to my brain. I was bleeding intracranially. Pressure was building within my skull. The other slug ruptured my spleen, and I was also bleeding internally. I was alive, but in a coma. Time wasn't on my side. The operation was blown, but we had to find out what had gone wrong. Had the subject I was trying to recruit shot me? Had the KGB or the GRU learned of our operations, our methods? Were others at risk of assassination? Was it time to roll up our team and exfiltrate? We had to get those answers, and I was the only one who might have them. We could have a leak, a mole, a double agent. The questions went on and on. If we had a spy in the upper echelon of our service, we had to root him out. If they kept me alive long enough, details I might provide could be important to our national security. But I was dying in the sub-basement of an ancient Russian ministry building. It just so happened that the best brain surgeon on earth, an American by the name of Conrad Jensen, was visiting Moscow with a diplomatic medical delegation when I was shot. They actually dragged your father from dinner with the American ambassador and spirited him away to where he performed surgery on me under the light of a bare bulb with limited tools. Conrad got the bullets out and stabilized me. A month after that, I was in a British hospital and eventually made a full recovery. But the real story is what happened to your father, whom the KGB detained the next day. They'd singled him out from the American delegation and taken him into custody for questioning. The KGB was putting things together very quickly. They took him to a small room and sat him in a chair next to a steam radiator. KGB officers stared at him in silence for a few hours, waiting for the tension to break him. They didn't have enough information to justify a brutal interrogation or charge him with espionage, because he was, after all, under some level of diplomatic protection. And because he was there as a diplomat, a guest of the ambassador, they had to use some restraint. What they did to him was very psychologically distressing. The unspoken threat of torture and execution, standard punishments for espionage against the motherland, or at least long-term imprisonment in a Soviet labor camp, was very real. He lived in terror for 2 long days. Excuse me. They answered none of his questions. They fed him little, let him have no sleep, and the room got hotter and hotter. Remember that he had not eaten or slept in 24 hours by the time the ordeal with the KGB first began. He was exhausted and had no training for that kind of thing. Your father never cracked. He just sat there and stared down trained KGB operators for more than 40 hours. Stunned, Janet blinked away tears. Jensen showed no expression. Sand shook his head slowly. So what happened? Janet said at length. They eventually let him go, put him on a flight to Norway. They lost his luggage and all of his belongings. Mark chuckled. Dad used to chide my mom about the fun she missed because she'd stayed home from that trip. She was pregnant with my brother, Johnny. After clearing his throat, he added, he made the trip sound like nothing dramatic. He said he helped you with some kind of medical procedure, but he downplayed it. I thought maybe he stitched up a cut or something. I didn't know that you'd been shot on hostile soil. Years afterward, when he mentioned your intelligence background and the work you do now, I should have pieced it together. Brecht nodded. He was a civilian doctor with a wife and child and another on the way, and he risked everything to save a complete stranger in the service of his country. He could have declined without dishonor or repercussion, but he rose to the occasion and did what only a hero... Brecht's voice faltered. After several seconds of silence, Sand's soft baritone voice carried across the table. I'm lucky I get to benefit from that. Brecht took the opportunity to move to a new subject. Tell us more about Jackie. And if you're of a mind, tell us about yourself. With a sad smile, Sand shrugged. That's a tough act to follow, Albert. Not so. I know something of your background, sir. In your younger years, you could have been a star player on our team. Once again, Janet would not stand for mystery. What are you talking about, Albert? Robert Sand is a very interesting man, Janet. His own history is more impressive, and I mean this quite sincerely, than my own. He's done many good and heroic deeds over the years, facing danger all the way. He's a force of nature. Care to fill us in? Asked Mark. Brecht tipped his head. I'll leave that to Mr. Sand. Hey, said Sand, I'm just an old reprobate trying to find my gal, so I don't have to spend the rest of my days pining away alone watching reruns of Sanford and Son. Brecht's bushy eyebrows rose a notch. At that moment, a cell phone chirped from inside his jacket. He pulled it out, tapped the glass, and held it to his ear. Brecht, he said crisply. After listening for a moment, he spoke a few words. Well done. Where are they now? All right, thanks. He ended the call and returned the phone to his jacket. Well? Jensen asked. The rest of my team are here. We've recovered some surveillance video from the other side of the river. It's poor quality, but we're hoping to enhance it. This may give us a lead. We'll know more in the morning. No one spoke, but all stared. Would anyone care for dessert? Still, no one spoke. In that case, Would anyone object if I were to light my cigar? That was chapter 29 of Black Sunrise. Read it. You'll love it. Thanks for listening.